The wind howled through the jagged trees, bending them into ghostly shapes as John trudged along the muddy trail. The rain had turned the ground into a thick, sludgy mess, clinging to his boots with every step. He didn't mind the isolation. It was why he had taken the assignment. To be far from the noise of humanity, to work in silence, to feel the raw, untamed land beneath him. But today, the silence was different. It wasn't the peaceful solitude he had come to know. There was a weight in the air, a tension he couldn't shake. It had been like this for weeks now, as if the planet itself was watching him. He had seen movements in the forest, strange shapes darting between the trees, shadows just on the edge of his vision. But every time he looked, there was nothing there. The planet was supposed to be uninhabited, or so the reports had said when the colonization began. But John was starting to doubt that. The foggy, dense forest felt alive, hiding secrets just out of reach. He had been out longer than usual, and dusk was falling fast. As he approached the river that wound its way through the forest, the rain intensified, hammering the earth with an almost furious rhythm. The river swelled with the storm, its normally calm waters transformed into a violent, swirling current. As he reached the narrow wooden bridge, the roar of the river almost drowned out all other sound. Almost. Through the crashing water and the wind's howl, John heard something. A yelp, sharp and desperate. He froze, listening. It came again, louder this time, closer. His pulse quickened, and without thinking, he ran toward the sound. At the edge of the riverbank, he saw it. A massive, fur-covered creature thrashing in the water, its limbs desperately clawing at the air as the current pulled it under. It looked like a wolf, but not quite. Its fur was thicker, almost metallic in the pale light, and its limbs were longer, more agile. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto him for a brief second, full of panic and pleading. Without hesitation, John threw off his pack and leaped into the icy water. The cold hit him like a shockwave, but he pushed forward, fighting against the powerful current. The creature flailed, barely keeping its head above the water, and John knew it wouldn't last much longer. He swam with all his strength, the current pulling him downstream as he closed the distance. When he reached the creature, he grabbed onto its fur and pulled with every ounce of strength he had left. It fought at first, panic driving its claws into his arms, but then it seemed to understand. With one final, desperate effort, they reached the shore. Both collapsed onto the muddy ground, panting and exhausted. John lay there for a moment, catching his breath, before turning to look at the creature. It was like nothing he had ever seen, wolf-like, yes, but larger, more intelligent, with a presence that felt almost sentient. The creature's breathing was ragged, and its glowing eyes flickered weakly in the dim light. John knelt beside it, unsure what to do. He wasn't a medic, and even if he were, this creature wasn't like anything in his training. But it was alive, at least for now, and that was something. As he examined the creature more closely, he noticed strange symbols etched into its fur, barely visible under the layers of mud and water. They shimmered faintly in the twilight, alien in design, and something about them made John shiver. This wasn't just an animal. It was something far more. The wolf-like being tried to rise, but its legs gave out beneath it, and it collapsed with a low whine. John reached out, his hand hovering over the creature's side, unsure whether it would accept his help. To his surprise, the creature didn't pull away. Instead, it looked up at him with those strange, glowing eyes, and in them, John saw something he never expected: gratitude. For a long moment, man and alien wolf simply sat there, rain pouring around them, the river roaring in the background. John knew he couldn't leave it here. Whatever this creature was, it didn't belong out in the open, vulnerable to the elements or whatever else might be lurking in the forest. He managed to lift it, draping its massive frame over his shoulders, and began the slow, arduous trek back to his cabin. The journey was brutal, every step a battle against the rain and the mud, but John kept going. He couldn't explain it, but something deep inside him told him this creature was important. Its survival mattered. By the time he reached the cabin, he was soaked to the bone and exhausted, but he didn't stop. He laid the creature down on the floor, covering it with blankets, and stoked the fire until the room was filled with warmth. Hours passed, and the storm outside grew fiercer, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. John kept a close watch on the creature, noting how its breathing gradually steadied. He didn't know if it would survive the night, but he had done everything he could. As the night wore on, John found himself dozing in his chair, the fire's soft crackle lulling him into a restless sleep. But in his dreams, he saw the wolf, running through the forest, its fur gleaming under the starlight, those same strange symbols glowing brightly. It wasn't just running, though, it was hunting. He could feel its hunger, its desperation, and behind it, there was something else. Something dark, lurking in the shadows, waiting. He woke with a start, heart pounding, just as the creature stirred. Its eyes opened, brighter now, more aware. It tried to rise again, and this time it succeeded, though its movements were slow and cautious. John stayed where he was, unsure of how it would react now that it was conscious. For a moment, the wolf simply stood there, watching him. Then, in a movement too fast for him to fully register, it was beside him. It lowered its head slightly, as if in a gesture of thanks, before turning toward the door. John got to his feet, uncertain whether to stop it or let it go. But before he could decide, the creature paused and looked back at him. It wasn't just a glance. It was a question, an invitation. Something told him this wasn't over, that whatever had happened by the river was only the beginning. Without fully understanding why, John grabbed his coat and followed the creature out into the storm. The night was dark, the rain relentless, but the wolf moved with purpose. John struggled to keep up as it led him deeper into the forest, to places he had never been before. They moved in silence, the only sounds of wind and the distant rumble of thunder. After what felt like hours, they arrived at a clearing. In the center stood a massive stone monolith, ancient and weathered, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols that marked the wolf's fur. As John approached, a sense of unease settled over him. The air was thick with something old, powerful, and dangerous. The wolf stood at the base of the monolith, looking up at it, then back at John. It whined softly, as if urging him forward. John stepped closer, drawn to the monolith despite the dread pooling in his chest. When he reached out to touch it, a jolt of energy shot through him, and the world around him seemed to shift. He saw flashes, images of the wolf's past, its people, its world. A world long gone, destroyed by forces John couldn't comprehend. And in the center of it all, a darkness, vast and all-consuming, hunting them down. The wolf was the last of its kind, the last survivor of a species that had been wiped out, running from a force it couldn't escape. And now, that same darkness was here, on this planet, hunting them both. John staggered back, his mind reeling from the vision. The wolf stood beside him, its eyes full of sorrow. It hadn't just needed saving from the river, it needed saving from the inevitable. The ground beneath them rumbled, and in the distance, a shadow began to form, rising from the forest like smoke. The darkness had found them. John knew there was no escape. Not for him, not for the wolf. The creature let out a mournful howl, the sound piercing the night, full of grief and acceptance. Together, they stood before the monolith as the darkness closed in, its cold tendrils wrapping around them both. In the end, the only thing left was the echo of the wolf's howl, fading into the storm. The echo of the wolf's howl lingered in John's ears, a haunting sound that seemed to ripple through the very fabric of the night. His heart pounded in his chest as the dark presence approached, a swirling mass of shadow that seemed to devour the light around it. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, as if savoring the fear that filled the air. John glanced at the wolf beside him. Its eyes were still glowing, but the light within them had dimmed, as though the weight of centuries of running, hiding, and loss had finally caught up to it. There was no fight left in it, only resignation. It had been hunted across galaxies, and now, on this desolate planet, its time had run out. But John wasn't ready to give up, not yet. "Run," he whispered to the wolf, though he knew it was pointless. The creature remained where it was, its gaze locked on the approaching shadow. There was a strange serenity in its posture, a kind of peace in knowing that the chase was over. John, however, was human, and humans were stubborn creatures. He grabbed a fallen branch from the ground, its surface slick with rain, and turned to face the darkness. It felt absurd, standing there with a stick in his hand, but it was all he had. The darkness drew closer, and as it did, the air grew colder. The wind that had once howled through the trees fell silent, leaving only the eerie sound of the shadow moving, like the soft whisper of something far too large to be seen. And then, just as the darkness was upon them, it stopped. For a moment, it hung there in the air, suspended like a living entity watching. John could feel its gaze on him, though it had no eyes. The pressure of it was suffocating, and he fought the urge to collapse to his knees. His grip tightened on the branch, though he knew it was useless. The shadow shifted, and from within its depths, a shape began to form, tall, humanoid, but indistinct, as if it was made from the very fabric of the night itself. It stepped forward, and though its face was hidden, John could feel the immense, ancient malice radiating from it. "You saved it," a voice said, though it wasn't really a voice at all. It was more like the echo of thoughts, slipping into John's mind, bypassing words entirely. "Why?" John swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the rain that continued to fall around him. It needed help. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering his answer. Help, a curious notion for one so far from home. "Did you think it would save you in return?" John shook his head, his grip on the branch loosening. "No, I just couldn't let it die." The shadow seemed to ripple, as if amused. "And yet, death is the only certainty. For you, for it, for all things." Behind him, the wolf let out a low growl, a final act of defiance. John could feel the creature's fear and sadness, but also its resolve. It knew what was coming, and it was ready to face it. The shadow figure turned its attention to the wolf. "You have run long enough," it said, its voice echoing across the clearing. "There is no more hiding, no more fleeing." The wolf stood tall, its eyes blazing one last time with an inner fire that defied the darkness. John felt a surge of emotion, admiration, sorrow, helplessness, all blending together as he watched the creature he had saved face its fate. The shadow moved swiftly, its tendrils wrapping around the wolf like a cloak of death. The wolf howled once more, a sound so mournful and piercing that it seemed to shake the very trees around them. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a farewell. The howl faded into silence as the wolf's form was consumed by the darkness, vanishing as though it had never existed. John stood frozen, his heart heavy with grief. The creature was gone. The being he had fought so hard to save had been taken, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The shadow shifted again, and John knew it would be his turn next. The air around him grew colder still, and his body trembled. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense of loss. "You fought for it," the voice in his mind whispered. "You tried to save it. But everything comes to an end. Human. Even you." John dropped the branch. There was no point in resisting. He was alone now, just as he had been before, just as he had always been. He thought of the wolf, its glowing eyes filled with gratitude, the bond they had formed in those brief moments by the river. He thought of the ancient monolith and the weight of the visions it had shown him, the destruction, the darkness, the inevitable end. He closed his eyes. The shadow moved, its tendrils reaching for him, and in that final moment, John felt a strange sense of peace. He had done what he could. He had tried to make a difference, even in the face of something far beyond his understanding. As the darkness wrapped around him, pulling him into its cold embrace, he whispered one last word into the storm. "Goodbye." The forest was silent once more. The storm had passed, the river calmed, and the clearing stood empty beneath the pale light of a distant moon. The monolith remained ancient and unmoved, a silent witness to the end of the chase. There was no trace of the man or the wolf, only the faint echo of a howl, carried on the wind as the darkness faded into the night.